The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. It is Friday, 24th of April, 2026. We're live here on CHD TV. I'm going to be getting Karl Jablonowski on in a second from our science department, but following this segment will be Brian Hooker with Jeremy Hammond, and they're going to be doing an excellent presentation on aluminum. So please stay tuned to that. It's very important. But today we're going to fact check Paul Offit. It's important that we do this. They're wheeling him back out again because they're clearly panicking. But for those of you that may need a little reminder of who Paul Offit is, when we were on the Vax bus, our cameraman producer, Josh Coleman, asked him very nicely if he would like to do an interview on the Vax bus to put a point across his point of view. And this was the response.
I think they wanted to see if they could get an interview with you, Paul. Are you up for that? An interview over the Vax bus?
Who are you?
I'm just a camera guy.
No.
You're not interested?
Are you kidding me?
Well, just we could talk about differences in opinion and.
You know you can't do that here, right? Get out of here. Get the fuck out of here. Really, I don't want to talk to you.
All right.
All right.
I mean, I just think if you have the truth on your side, you'd be up for just having a conversation.
Out.
All right.
Okay. I need to ask you order.
Very rude. All right, now I'm going to bring on Karl Jablonowski, and we are going to fact check him, or he's going to fact check him. Good morning, Karl.
Good morning, Polly.
Well, thank you for being here. And it's important that we do this because he keeps spouting things that are untrue. And, well, the public needs to know the truth. And so no one is better than you to do this. So let's have a look at what he did. How to be an effective anti-vaccine activist. He basically goes through all these arguments, and he really blames Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for pretty much everything. Thanks to RFK Jr., American children have suffered from preventable diseases like measles, whooping cough. Rule number one, lie about vaccine safety, basically saying RFK Jr. has falsely claimed that the measles vaccine, blah, 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 on it goes. Rule number two, lie about vaccine efficacy. So he goes on about a 7-minute video claiming measles and pertussis deaths were eliminated. And rule number three, actively suppressing studies showing that vaccines are safe and effective. Well, I'm just going to hand this straight over to Karl.
Well, thank you. This is certainly a playbook, as I have been lied to about vaccine safety, and I have been lied to about vaccine efficacy, and certainly important studies have been suppressed that address vaccine safety and efficacy. So in rule number one, when Dr. Paul Offit claims that, the RFK is claiming that the measles vaccines cause blindness and deafness, the measles vaccines and all live virus vaccines come from the original wild type vaccine, except for virus, except for our vaccines for smallpox was actually originally derived from cowpox, and then we have a vaccine that we actually lost provenance over. Nobody really knows what happened to it in labs. It just emerged from labs. And when we could genetically test it, we did, and it appeared to be closely related to horsepox. But all of the other live virus vaccines depend on originating wild type virus. And you take that and you pass it through time after time after time in other tissue to grow the culture. There is a possibility that the mutations that they adapt to living in those conditions can revert to their original virulent form. And so it is certainly possible that any live virus vaccine can inadvertently infect the person with a dangerous virus. He's also criticizing RFK for saying that the COVID vaccine was the deadliest vaccine ever made. I think the extreme deployment of the COVID vaccines over the entire world really does prove that point. It may not be the most lethal per dose, but it certainly is taking top prize for total deaths. And then he's criticizing RFK for saying that the hepatitis B vaccine causes autism. Every hepatitis B vaccine has an aluminum adjuvant, and Dr. Brian Hooker and myself, as well as several other prominent scientists, have published a causal relationship of aluminum adjuvants in vaccines to the manifestations of autism. His rule number 2, lie about vaccine efficacy, is kind of a funny one, because vaccines are appearing on the coattail of some major modern innovations to hygiene and sanitation and the modern medicine. And then his rule number 3 about actively suppressing studies showing that vaccines are safe and effective. First, he highlights an RSV study that the CDC apparently didn't do all of the PR that that Paul Offit wanted it to. That study is in itself an odd study. It's an ecological study. What they did is they took a look at RSV before vaccines and monoclonal antibodies were widely available back in 2018 and 2020, and compared those rates with RSV prevalence in 2024-25. Now, to even make that comparison, you have to believe that the ecosystem is identical. But gosh, what changed between 2018 and 2025? Well, there was a giant pandemic that right smack in the middle of that really changed the landscape for infectious diseases around the world. But I think caution is extremely prudent when talking about RSV and our interventions against it. There was a study out of France last September examining RSV breakthrough infections of children who were primed with a monoclonal antibody to prevent it. It turns out that 13% of the breakthrough infections were actually resistant to Beyfortus or nirsevimab, the monoclonal antibody used against it, and none in the infants who were not primed with it, which is actually the genesis of it appears to be the genesis of resistance right there. Which, if that is actually true, Beyfortus is all it's doing is moving the chess pieces around on the antigen map, and will soon become irrelevant as many RSV infections will be monoclonal antibody resistant. Now, last Tuesday there was a publication on RSV and pregnancies, and it appeared that from earlier studies that women who got RSV immunization were more likely to have preterm birth. And so what this study did was examined that signal for preterm birth. And what it found was that there was no statistical significant signal for preterm birth, but there was for pregnancy-associated hypertensive disorder and for a thing called PROM, which is premature rupture of membranes. Now, the authors tell you to take that with a grain of salt because of limiting, confounding control, which is interesting because that same limiting, confounding control would be a threat to the validity of saying that there's no association with preterm birth. Now, further in Paul Offit's, rule number 3 about suppressing studies was a CDC study that was going to describe the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine. And it was paused and then canceled by acting director Jay Bhattacharya. This study is a test negative design, which takes healthy adults and compares those who present with illness, compares their tests for COVID, having illness, and having a vaccine or not having had a vaccine. Now, for a test negative design to be valid, both groups, the vaccinated and unvaccinated, have to practically be identical. They need identical immune systems, they need identical social behavior, and they need identical healthcare seeking behavior. If any of those are untrue, the study itself is invalid. So I ask, who is still getting boosted for COVID-19 in the 25-26 season? I actually know people who have gotten absolutely every COVID vaccine ever recommended, but somehow in 2025-26, they were convinced that the risk benefit no longer applies to them. It no longer falls into their favor. So the idea that the two groups, who's getting vaccinated and not getting vaccinated, are identical in social behavior or healthcare seeking behavior is absolutely ridiculous. The vaccination can by itself put your immune system into disarray, causing off-target diseases. And if you go get tested because you were vaccinated and your immune system is all wonky, you're going to show up negative for the disease you're vaccinated against, in theory, as opposed to the people who aren't vaccinated might wait until their severity of illness is high enough to then go get tested. And if they test positive, that increases the vaccine efficacy. I want my tax dollars to stop funding test negative designs. They are horribly misleading. And the best keystone publication of test negative design was Dr. Shrestha from the Cleveland Clinic when he assessed prospectively the efficacy of the influenza vaccine in the 24-25 season. And he found negative 27% efficacy. That is, people who were vaccinated were more likely to get influenza. That same year, the CDC, using a test negative design, it reported it tied for the second highest efficacy ever. Those two are at complete odds with each other. And a test negative design is not the valid one in this case when you have the ability to do a prospective study.
Karl, I want to go back to why they are attacking Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with its measles, Hep B. They're not really going too far out of that zone, but why are they? Is that because they're the two things that he's speaking out about? But they're really coming for him hard, and Paul Offit's piece is an attempt at that.
That is true. Measles, I think, is for political purposes. There's an outbreak right now. They keep dragging out those two girls in West Texas who died from measles, even though those two girls from West Texas died of medical malpractice. Hepatitis B is likely in the spotlight because there is a big push by the ironically named Vaccine Integrity Project and the former director of CDC, Rochelle Walensky, to re-implement the hepatitis B vaccine universally for all infants, even though it is really not warranted. And the hepatitis B vaccine does put a spotlight on aluminum adjuvants, which Paul Offit himself was published in JAMA a couple months ago, talking about how it's perfectly safe because we eat it. We eat aluminum, so therefore it must be safe to inject aluminum, which is utterly ridiculous statement.
Carl, I don't understand. So, I mean, Paul Offit is some kind of medical doctor, right? And so, therefore, we're all led to believe medical doctors have kind of brains because they have to learn things, go to medical school and stuff like that. Right? Why is he so wrong? It's like and I don't mean this to be rude, but he's either really not very clever or he's bought out or both. I don't know. But how can you say the things that he's saying? And it's not just Paul Off. I'm not just picking on him. There are others, of course, we know. But I don't understand how they can sleep at night, or do they genuinely believe what they're saying?
Well, when it comes to being bought out, I mean, he is part of the establishment for pushing vaccines. Paul Offit is one of the 4 authors of the book on vaccines, which is Plotkins, Ornstein, Offit, and Edwards. Paul Offit is co-inventor of the Rototech vaccine, which is a live virus vaccine grown in monkey kidney cells. He invented it with 2 Stanley Plotkins, the grandfather of vaccines, and another guy named Clark. Both the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Worcester owned it. Worcester Institute is the WI in the aborted fetal cell line used for the rubella and varicella and adenovirus vaccines. And then they sold that in one lump sum to Merck, which Paul Offit's payout was a minimum of $6 million, quite possibly a lot higher depending on contracts that no one's privy to. But he is the establishment. He cannot be the author in the book of vaccines and come out and say, yeah, maybe not all vaccines are safe.
Carl, so would you say, summarizing up what Paul Offit has written, would you class his piece as misinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely call this misinformation. And in fact, it is a playbook for pushing vaccines that we know not to be safe onto the public.
Well, I can't let you go. We've got a couple of minutes without asking you. For me, it's been a fantastic week with the military that they do not have to take the flu vaccine, which is such. I mean, I can't tell you what that means to them. So many of them fighting against it and being punished right up until the last moment. And now the flu vaccine is not mandatory anymore. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think it's logical, even for force readiness, to not give a vaccine that, looks like it is that has negative efficacy, that is more likely to get influenza. But yeah, I cheer the military for that move.
And we hope that anti-vax is next up on the list. I mean, that has to go, Carl.
Yeah, that is a nasty one itself.
Yeah, I mean, I know people that are trying to just get awful jobs in the military so they don't have to be deployed, so they don't have to get anti-vax. There's something wrong in that whole thing.
Right. And the military is usually the early adopters of vaccines. In early 2000, they were vaccinated with smallpox vaccines because of the threat of a biological warfare, and that caused a lot of myocarditis cases. And in fact, the author of that paper, one of the authors, was the same author who wrote about myocarditis in military members who were vaccinated for the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, well, look, Karl Jablonowski, thank you so much for being on this morning. And we really appreciate your wisdom, your knowledge, and educating us. And we're going to get you back on again next week. So we'll see you next week. But thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you, Polly.
To the viewers, just to say what was on the military subject, the Children's Health Defense film, the new movie out on June the 30th, worldwide in theaters. It's live now. So you go to dutytodisobeyfilm.com and look for your area and sign up to go to it's just for one night only, so we can all get together. I'm going to be at the Cedar Park one here in Austin. with my family. So I hope to see as many of you possible there. But do sign up. And if you can't see something in your area, contact the team and they will help you find a theatre. We have 120 theatres now booked for that night. So it's going to be a big family get together and support for the military and what they have to go through with, as they describe, being treated as lab rats. So thank you for your support on that and for the military as well. Right, we're now going to go to the much awaited Brian Hooker's Doctors and Scientists, and he's interviewing Jeremy Hammond. So enjoy this.
Well, good morning, CHD. It's your host, Dr. Brian Hooker, and you are right in time for Doctors and Scientists. Today, we are airing a special presentation by investigative journalist Jeremy Hammond, and the presentation is on aluminum adjuvant in vaccines. This is such an important presentation. Jeremy is a good friend of CHD, a good friend of mine, and you really need to watch this. After this presentation, I hope to have him live on my show as a guest soon. So stay tuned for coming attractions because we'll have Jeremy on the show directly and we can interview him and ask him some more questions about his work on aluminum. Enjoy and have a great Friday.
My name is Jeremy Hammond, and I'd like to present a tale of two studies. My aim with this presentation is to clearly explain why the claim vaccines do not cause autism is disinformation. I will also reveal with two clear examples how studies are designed to support predetermined conclusions. As we all know, the CDC has historically claimed that vaccines do not cause autism. We're told incessantly by the government, media, and medical establishment that science has proven this. We're told to trust the experts who tell us so. We are constantly confronted with the appeal to authority fallacy, ad hominem attacks, and gaslighting. Parents are told to disbelieve their own personal experiences and to disregard their own judgment. Stop doing your own research. Stop asking questions. Stop thinking for yourselves. Just have faith and line your kids up for their shots. In November 2025, under the leadership of HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the CDC's Autism and Vaccines webpage was updated to state that the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not evidence-based because the possibility has not been ruled out. The medical establishment predictably reacted to this by accusing Kennedy of politicizing the CDC to further an anti-vaccine agenda. Status quo advocates maintain that the old version of the page was correct. So who is right? How can we, as non-experts, possibly know what's true? When parents facing vaccination decisions for their child are told to trust experts, the underlying premise is that the medical establishment couldn't possibly be wrong. We're told that to question vaccine policies is equivalent to believing in a preposterous conspiracy theory. But it's not a conspiracy. Explaining how the experts could be wrong is easily enough accomplished by simply observing the structure of the current medical system and the perverse incentives it creates. Science is not some infallible monolithic institution. Instead of policies being based on the science, government policies aiming to serve the pharmaceutical industry's financial interests determine the direction of research. The scientific community is comprised of individuals who make subjective valuations and who respond to incentives. Lucrative careers can be made providing dutiful service to the regime. Scientists and doctors are not immune to confirmation bias and groupthink. Academic degrees may reflect successful indoctrination more than acquisition of independent thinking skills. As recognized within the medical literature, the medical establishment is rife with corruption and conflicts of interest. Funding from the government and pharmaceutical industry is directed towards scientists who will reliably produce the desired results. Scientists and doctors who challenge medical orthodoxy face persecution, including loss of funding or licensure, respectively. And it's not like the medical establishment has never been wrong before. Into the late 1800s, mainstream medicine scoffed at the idea of hand-washing, until Ignaz Semmelweis challenged medical orthodoxy by showing how the practice dramatically reduced maternal deaths after childbirth. Even then, he went to his grave still mocked and scorned by physicians who refused to believe that their own actions were killing women. Of course, who can forget how the medical establishment allied with the tobacco industry to firmly deny that smoking cigarettes was harmful up until the 1960s? Tobacco science is alive and well today. In the 1950s and 60s, the drug thalidomide received regulatory approval in many Western countries as a sedative and to treat nausea during pregnancy, causing thousands of children to be born with severe birth defects. Right up until around a decade ago, the dominant view within the medical establishment and regulatory apparatus was that prescription opioids were a safe treatment for chronic pain with low risk for addiction, leading to an opioid epidemic that largely drove the first decline in life expectancy in the U.S. in nearly a century. And we can all remember how the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines were sold to the public based on the false claim that 2 doses would confer durable sterilizing immunity, stopping infection and transmission of the virus and ending the pandemic through herd immunity. Science advances not because institutions are infallible, but because they eventually correct themselves, often after years or decades of being confidently wrong. The public debate about vaccines must also be understood within the context of governmental policy. Policy goal is to maintain high vaccination rates at all costs. This was starkly illustrated by the FDA in the Federal Register in June 1984, when it responded to public concerns about the continued use of the oral polio vaccine, which by then posed a higher risk of causing paralytic polio than the polio virus itself, by stating, "Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist, in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives." The public needs to understand that this remains the paradigm of the public health establishment. Well-founded doubts about vaccine safety, including concerns about vaccines causing autism, cannot be allowed to exist. With that background in mind, since we are dealing with questions of science, we need to translate the CDC's claim that vaccines do not cause autism into more scientifically meaningful language. When you hear people say that, what they are really claiming is that the vaccine autism hypothesis has been falsified. So, to evaluate the claim, we also need to know what that hypothesis is. I would define the current working hypothesis grounded in scientific knowledge to date as follows. Vaccines administered according to CDC or AAP recommendations can contribute to the development of autism in susceptible subpopulations of children. Next, we need to examine what science really tells us about that hypothesis. As I'm about to show you, what the government, media, and medical establishment say science says about vaccines and what the medical literature actually tells us are 2 completely different things. One of the best ways to demonstrate the huge disparity between the public messaging and the science is to simply compare the CDC's claims about vaccine safety with its own cited sources from the medical literature. You'd think that the media would do that, but they don't. Instead, they just take the CDC's word for things as a matter of faith, without doing any kind of critical analysis. But we are interested in science, not dogma, so let's take a look. Returning again to the CDC's claim that vaccines do not cause autism, one of the key sources historically cited on that webpage is a 2004 review by the Institute of Medicine titled Immunization Safety Review, Vaccines and Autism. Just on its face, that review does not support the CDC's statement. The IOM noted that studies had only looked at one vaccine or one ingredient, MMR or the mercury-based preservative thimerosal, respectively. One obvious shortcoming of this body of research was how it completely overlooked concerns about aluminum adjuvanted vaccines. It also overlooked concerns about the safety of the CDC's schedule as a whole. Focusing on the question of mercury toxicity, the IOM concluded that the hypothesis that exposure to thimerosal-containing vaccines could be associated with neurodevelopmental disorders is biologically plausible, and the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship. The IOM cited an FDA study in 2001 admitting how the CDC's schedule had been exposing infants to cumulative levels of mercury in excess of the government's own safety guidelines. The CDC has an obvious motive to deny that its policies cause harm. The IOM acknowledged that the form of mercury in vaccines is a known neurotoxin that accumulates in the brain, could plausibly cause autism in susceptible subpopulations of children, and has a known potential to injure the nervous system. In sum, to support its claim that vaccines do not cause autism, the CDC cites a 2004 IOM review affirming that existing studies are inadequate to reject the hypothesis. The mercury-based preservative in vaccines is a known neurotoxin that accumulates in the brain and can injure the nervous system. In other words, the CDC's claim that the body of literature reviewed by the IOM proves that vaccines do not cause autism is a rejection of the standards of evidence adopted by its own cited source. Let's look at another example. On the same webpage, the CDC has historically cited another Institute of Medicine review to support its claim that vaccines do not cause autism. The CDC's link is to the IOM's 2012 review titled Adverse Effects of Vaccines, Evidence and Causality. But what did it really say? The language adopted by the IOM was that the available evidence favors rejection of the hypothesis that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That's the conclusion the CDC relies on, but that's not the same thing as saying that the hypothesis can be rejected. The IOM recognized that the hypothesis had not been falsified. The IOM noted that an absence of studies finding an association is not evidence of no association, and none of the studies that had been done could rule out the possibility that the vaccine causes autism in susceptible subpopulations of children. The scientific evidence supported the conclusion that certain children are at high risk of suffering adverse effects of vaccination. Studies, therefore, should not assume a homogeneous effect, with an autism outcome being attributed to random chance, as though every child had an equal risk. On the contrary, existing research already suggested that most children who suffer adverse reactions to vaccinations have a pre-existing susceptibility that could be genetic or environmental in nature. Genetic conditions do not dictate that children are born with autism. Environmental triggers may be required, like vaccination. The IOM acknowledged the need to compare health outcomes between vaccinated and unvaccinated children. And it acknowledged the association between brain inflammation, a known adverse effect of vaccines, and autism. So, given the acknowledged biological plausibility, how did the IOM arrive at its conclusion that the evidence favors the rejection of the hypothesis? Most of the studies it reviewed were deemed too unreliable to base any conclusions upon. The IOM narrowed it down to just 5 studies. Out of those, only 2 compared rates of autism between MMR vaccinated and MMR unvaccinated children. All assumed a homogeneous risk. None considered the possibility of susceptible subpopulations. None considered or controlled for a selection bias, commonly called healthy user bias, or in this case, healthy vaccinee bias. One did, however, acknowledge the risk of healthy vaccinee bias as a study limitation. It might be, the authors observed, that parents who notice early symptoms of developmental abnormalities are more likely to avoid the MMR vaccine. Hence, a selection bias may be introduced whereby children at higher risk for autism get pooled into the MMR unvaccinated cohort, which could skew findings toward finding no association between the MMR vaccine and autism. In sum, to support the claim that vaccines do not cause autism, the CDC cites a 2011 IOM review concluding that the evidence favors the rejection of the hypothesis based on 5 studies, which were not designed to test the hypothesis that the MMR vaccine is a contributing factor in the development of autism in susceptible subpopulations of children. Of course, it's not just the CDC. We hear the same claim from the American Academy of Pediatrics, a medical trade organization that transparently receives funding from the pharmaceutical industry. For instance, an AAP press release in 2017 claimed that the hypothesis had been disproven by a robust body of medical literature. So I contacted the AAP and asked it to support that claim by providing me with studies that considered subpopulations of genetically susceptible children, or that compared health outcomes, including autism, between fully vaccinated and completely unvaccinated children. In response, the AAP directed me to a page of their website healthychildren.org, where they had a list of studies supposedly proving vaccine safety. But not one of those studies considered genetic susceptibility, and not one included an unvaccinated control group. When I pointed this out and asked how the AAP could draw such a firm conclusion, given the obvious methodological limitations of existing studies, the response I received was, "No further comment." And of course, the mainstream media do their part to support the political and financial agenda of achieving high vaccination rates. Professional propagandists masquerade as journalists, manufacturing consent for coercive vaccination policies instead of exposing the corruption and empowering individuals with the knowledge necessary to make their own informed choice. A salient example is this Washington Post article by Lena Sun from 2017, which, to reassure parents, claimed that no new vaccine is added to the CDC's childhood schedule until it has been studied for safety when given with all other vaccines on the schedule. Recognizing that claim as false, I contacted the Post to request a correction, communicating with Sun and her editors via email, and also speaking with Sun on the phone. I challenged her to provide any evidence to support her claim, which she did not do. I showed how her claim was directly contradicted by a 2013 IOM review of vaccine safety. I quoted the IOM stating that no studies have ever compared health outcomes between children vaccinated according to the CDC schedule and unvaccinated children. No studies have ever examined the health effects of the CDC schedule as a whole. The consequence was that Lena Sun and her editors at the Washington Post refused to issue a correction, and to this day, the Post continues to brazenly and willfully lie to parents about vaccine safety. With all that context in mind, let's take a deeper look at the nature of the studies we are supposed to believe have falsified the vaccine autism hypothesis. We can focus on two that we're told have conclusively shown that there's no possible link. First, let's take a study out of Denmark by Anders Vid and co-authors that was published in Annals of Internal Medicine in March 2019. The study by Vid et al. Was hailed by the medical establishment and the media as conclusively proving that the MMR vaccine is not associated with autism, even in genetically susceptible children. The explicitly stated aim was to address this methodological limitation of all prior studies. But a critical analysis of this study reveals how it was effectively designed to find no association. That is the argument Dr. Brian Hooker, Dr. Jeet Varia, and I make in a paper published in May 2025 in the Journal of Biotechnology and Biomedicine, titled Vid et al. 2019 Vaccine Autism Study. Much ado about nothing. Vid et al. Claimed to have tested the hypothesis that the MMR vaccine can cause autism in genetically susceptible children. But the first thing they did was to exclude children with any of several genetic disorders associated with a higher risk of autism. Instead, they adopted the very narrow definition of genetic susceptibility as having a sibling with autism. Thus, if a child had a sibling diagnosed with autism after entrance into the study, they were misclassified as not genetically susceptible. 49% of the study population couldn't meet the definition by virtue of being an only child. The exclusionary criteria and inadequate definition of genetic susceptibility ensured that any real safety signal was drowned out in all the noise. It was touted as a very large study with a sample population of over 657,000 children. But only 0.13% met their definition of genetic susceptibility, a very small population of 838 children. And MMR vaccinated children in that key subgroup were diagnosed with autism at a nearly 2.7 times higher rate than the MMR unvaccinated, and the failure of that result to achieve statistical significance could just be due to the small sample size resulting from their exclusionary criteria and misleading definition of genetic susceptibility. Importantly, Vid et al. Borrowed their definition from a 2015 study by Jane et al. In JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. That study was also touted by the media as finding no association between the MMR vaccine and autism, even in genetically susceptible children. But that conclusion did not follow logically from the study's findings. In fact, that's not even the hypothesis the study was designed to test. Instead, the authors set out to determine whether parents of children who have an older sibling with autism are less likely to do the MMR vaccine with the younger child. And guess what? Their findings supported that hypothesis. Just as they hypothesized, the MMR vaccination rate among children with an older autistic sibling was significantly lower. The authors reasoned that this could be because parents are more likely to avoid the shot if they already have one child diagnosed with autism. Or, if parents observe early signs of developmental delay or abnormality, they are more likely to skip the MMR vaccine out of concern it could trigger autism or otherwise exacerbate the child's symptoms. The findings confirmed the risk of healthy user bias in vaccine autism studies, which, as the authors admitted, could explain why their data suggested a negative association between the vaccine and autism, as though vaccination reduced the risk. The logical conclusion of their findings is not that the MMR vaccine doesn't increase the risk of autism, but that children at higher risk of autism are less likely to get the vaccine. The possibility remains that avoidance of vaccination prevents autism diagnoses. The further corollary is that studies are needed that control for this inherent selection bias in observational data. Coming back to Vid et al., healthy user bias could help explain the finding of a statistically significant negative association between the MMR and autism in female children. The authors even claimed a protective effect of the vaccine, without proposing any biological mechanism that could explain it. As a simple thought experiment, if the association had gone in the other direction, would they have said that the vaccine increased the risk for autism in girls? Or would they have stressed that correlation doesn't equal causation? The lack of curiosity and double standard clearly demonstrate the authors' lack of scientific objectivity. While borrowing the definition of genetic susceptibility from Jane et al., Vid et al. Made no attempt to control for the selection bias they identified. Instead, they appeared to dismiss the possibility by saying there were no appreciable differences in vaccine uptake according to autism history in siblings. But their data tell a different story, showing that children with an autistic sibling were less likely to receive the MMR vaccine. They were aware of how this selection bias could result in their study artifactually finding no association, and they admitted that their findings were premised on the assumption of unbiased results. Furthermore, they admitted that it's possible their findings could be biased if onset of symptoms results in avoidance of vaccination. But they should have considered it not merely possible, but likely. It could help explain the trend in their data toward a negative association. It was a deliberate choice in study design to disregard this probable selection bias and instead to assume its non-existence. Other problems with the study include the following. Roughly a third of the study population was generally too young by the end of follow-up to have received an autism diagnosis. They did not consider a second dose of MMR in their primary analysis. A secondary analysis failed to account for a change in the recommendation from age 12 to age 4. The national database they used is known to underreport vaccine coverage, with a prior study having found that 55% of children classified as MMR unvaccinated in the registry were in fact vaccinated, according to medical records. There is a major discrepancy among the rate of autism in their study population and the reported rate of autism in the Danish population, indicating that thousands of autistic children were missing from their study. Their sample is not representative of Denmark's childhood population, much less the US is, where there has been a much more aggressive vaccine schedule. There is a major contradiction in their data, which show a decreasing rate of autism from one birth cohort to the next, which is the opposite of what's written in their text and the observed trend in Denmark. The authors declined to explain the self-contradiction, and the refusal to release the de-identified data to other researchers means their findings are irreproducible. Additionally, both the study authors and 2 of the journal's editors had conflicts of interest with financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. That helps to explain the hard-to-escape conclusion that the study was designed to find no association. The month after we published our critique of the MMR autism study by Offit et al., another study out of Denmark was published in the same journal by Nicholas Worm Andersen et al. Once again, it was hailed by the media and medical establishment as conclusive proof of vaccine safety, this time that aluminum-containing vaccines do not increase the risk of allergic diseases, autoimmunity, or neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism. The senior author was none other than Anders Fid, and it followed a familiar playbook. A peer-reviewed critique, which I'm honored to have collaborated on, has now been published that highlights numerous problems with the study. The new paper argues that the study's flaws prevent meaningful conclusions about the safety of aluminum-containing vaccines and highlight the need for more rigorous, transparent, and scientifically grounded investigations. To briefly review some of the key issues, first, the study did not compare health outcomes between children who received aluminum-containing vaccines and those who did not. The study included over 1.2 million Danish children born between 1997 and 2018 and compared health outcomes between children with different levels of exposure by age 2. This included over 15,000 children classified as unexposed that they could have used as a control group, but didn't. Instead, they compared incremental differences in aluminum exposure, a vaccinated versus vaccinated study. The authors assumed a linear dose-response relationship despite prior evidence for selective low-dose toxicity of aluminum adjuvants. They also assumed that the amount of aluminum in vaccines reported by manufacturers is accurate, despite prior evidence of high variability between vaccine batches. Once again, the authors started out by excluding children at higher risk, such as those diagnosed with respiratory conditions before age 2. Also excluded were over 34,000 children the authors considered to have received an implausible number of aluminum-containing vaccines, which in the U.S. would be considered typical for children following the CDC schedule. At the same time, they again ignored evidence for significant under-ascertainment of vaccination status in the National Registry as compared to medical records. They then also excluded any children who received a diagnosis of any of the measured outcomes before age 2. By these criteria, Andersen et al. Excluded the very children most likely to be at high risk of vaccination contributing to the development of chronic illness. There was a correlation between increasing aluminum exposure over time and increasing rates of chronic illness, but they adjusted the data for birth year, thus assuming this correlation was merely temporal and not causal in nature, an example of the petitio principii fallacy, or begging the question. They also begged the question by adjusting the data for number of general practitioner visits, as though it were an independent variable confounding their analysis. This introduced what's called collider bias, because number of doctor visits is directly influenced by both the exposure and the outcome. Vaccinations cause adverse events that drive more doctor visits. Avoidance of vaccination results in fewer visits. And more doctor visits might lead to more vaccinations, further exacerbating symptoms in a negative feedback loop. By adjusting the data for doctor visits, they effectively neutralized any real effect of the vaccine exposure on chronic illness. It's not a neutral adjustment, but assumes away the possibility that children may have fewer doctor visits precisely because they are healthier due to vaccine avoidance. By these means, the study was systematically biased in favor of finding no association. Ironically, this bias is starkly illustrated by their own key findings, which show statistically significant negative associations between aluminum-containing vaccines and certain autoimmune diseases, allergic diseases, and neurodevelopmental disorders. As Secretary Kennedy put it in an article calling for the study's retraction, if the medical establishment truly believed these data, they would be recommending aluminum injections to children as a prophylaxis against neurological and autoimmune diseases. And as Crépeau et al. State in the peer-reviewed critique, to our knowledge and understanding, this is the first time in medical literature where exposure to aluminum has been shown to be beneficial. Bearing in mind what is known about human exposure to aluminum, these unlikely benefits seriously challenge the validity of the whole study and its conclusions, and this fails to meet Hill's criterion of biological plausibility. Moreover, data were missing from the original supplement, and after a corrected version was published, it contradicted the author's claim to have found no evidence of harm, showing statistically significant increased risks. Among children in the 2007 to 2018 birth cohort, there was a 67% higher rate of Asperger syndrome diagnosis for every 1 milligram increase in aluminum exposure. Compared to children with moderate exposure, the highest exposure group had 9.7 additional diagnoses for neurodevelopmental disorders per 10,000 children, and 8.7 additional diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder per 10,000 children. To summarize, the so-called public health establishment is not an infallible institution. On the contrary, the system is thoroughly corrupt and geared around the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry. Public vaccine policies are premised on the view that any possible doubts about vaccine safety, no matter how well-founded, cannot be allowed to exist. The policy goal of maintaining high vaccination rates supersedes the goal of achieving a healthy childhood population. When people say that science has proven that vaccines do not cause autism, what they are really claiming is that studies have tested and falsified the hypothesis that the battery of vaccines administered according to official recommendations can contribute to the development of autism in susceptible subpopulations of children. But what the government, media, and medical establishment say science says about vaccines, and what the scientific literature really tells us, are two completely different things. The CDC's claims about vaccine safety are unsupported, if not directly contradicted, by its own cited sources. The IOM, in fact, admitted that the form of mercury used in vaccines is a known neurotoxin that accumulates in the brain and can injure the nervous system. None of the studies the IOM reviewed on the MMR vaccine in autism even considered the possibility of susceptible subpopulations of children. The American Academy of Pediatrics is an industry-funded trade organization granted the special privilege through the regime of medical licensing to determine standard of care in pediatric practices throughout the country. Like the federal health agencies, the AAP's policy goal of high vaccination rates conflicts with the goal of a healthy childhood population. Parents have long demanded that the studies be done comparing long-term health outcomes between fully vaccinated and completely unvaccinated children, but the establishment refuses on the grounds that we already know that vaccines are safe and effective. The mainstream media do policy advocacy instead of journalism, manufacturing consent for coerced mass vaccination. For instance, contrary to the Washington Post's willful lie, studies examining the safety of the CDC schedule as a whole do not exist. No studies have ever compared long-term health outcomes between fully vaccinated and completely unvaccinated children. Instead of testing the hypothesis that completely unvaccinated children are healthier, studies are carefully designed to avoid doing so. Scientists dutifully serving Big Pharma have learned how to design studies to find no association. For example, instead of controlling for a known selection bias, you can utilize it to produce the desired result. The 2019 study by Offit et al. On the MMR vaccine in autism, and the 2025 study by Anderson et al. On aluminum-containing vaccines and chronic illnesses are illuminating examples of how studies can be systematically biased in favor of the null hypothesis. Such studies are then uncritically hailed by the corrupt establishment to provide false reassurances to parents in furtherance of the political and financial agenda of a high vaccination rate. Meanwhile, we can see in the data on the rates of chronic diseases and disorders among the childhood population that the assumption that a high vaccination rate equals healthy children is false. In conclusion, the claim that scientific studies have proven that vaccines do not cause autism is false. The truth is that no studies have been designed to test the hypothesis that vaccines administered according to the CDC or AAP recommendations can contribute to the development of autism in susceptible subpopulations of children. Consequently, it is not logically possible for the hypothesis to have been falsified. The medical establishment is not going to correct itself, and the necessary change won't happen from the top down. It is up to each one of us to help combat the official disinformation and stand up in defense of the right to informed consent. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. To stay updated with my work and research, visit my site jeremyrhammond.com and sign up for my free newsletters.
Tell us your name, please.
John Davis.
And this is about your daughter. How old is your daughter today?
She is 19 today.
19 today.
Yes.
Okay, so how long ago did this happen?
This was about a year and a half ago.
Okay, talk us through what happened when your daughter was kicked out of school.
She had reviewed with us the advantages and disadvantages of taking her required senior year meningitis shot. And we gave her the option. She was almost 18 and she opted to out of the shot requirement. And in doing so, under West Virginia law, which is very restrictive for vaccine exemptions, there's still the ability for the child to stay in school under what's called provisional enrollment. Our county, even though it's a statewide process, our county schools denied her that provisional enrollment, and they kicked her out of school, actually on multiple occasions, to the point where we had to engage legal counsel and found them accountable in the court for violating the laws, and were able to obtain a restraining order and injunction against Wood County Schools, just so she could rather stay in school while we continued to pursue the only exemption, medical exemption, that's allowed in West Virginia.
So many people will be asking, wow, your daughter refused the shot. Most children that age wouldn't even know to even think about even looking into a shot. So tell us a bit about your daughter and why she did that, because we're very impressed.
I was impressed with her too. She's quite a strong, brave young lady. Our eyes were opened a few years ago when COVID hit and all the shots were being pushed there. We actually have a Patriot group that has looked into a lot of the misrepresentation of that shot and all of the adverse effects that have occurred as a result. So we thought, well, we kind of blindly, like most folks, been going along with all of the vaccines throughout the years, and we found out that she actually had probably been injured from a prior vaccine, and discussed with a doctor and some other individuals. This doctor had actually treated a prior student that had been injured from the same vaccine, and she opted out of it, in particular one of the long-term effects with fertility issues, and she wants to have a family someday. So we didn't think it was going to be a problem just opting out of it for her to stay in school while we exhausted the exemption process, but the county didn't see it that way, so we didn't get off square one without having to engage in legal action.
And so really would love to know, how did she cope with the being kicked out of school? How did she cope with the, I presume, bullying and insults thrown at her? Talk us through some of that.
She was harassed. Without doubt, there was no support at the school at all. She has a lot of faith in God and kept doing some deep digging and just continued to stay her beautiful, positive self throughout the entire event. But she was actually intimidated. The assistant principal, when we explained to them the process and how she's allowed to stay in school, was getting it from higher ups that she had to go home, and offered that the police officer take her home, which I thought was quite intimidating. And in addition to that, we knew that there were other students who were allowed to stay in school even though they had not pursued an exemption and didn't have their shot. So quite frankly, it's medical discrimination as well as what they have done to her.
So they picked on her?
Mm-hmm, they did.
So for a parent listening now thinking, okay, you've done this, how do I do it? How difficult is it? Do you have to be a lawyer? Do you have to have a ton of money? How do you go through this process? Educate
yourself. First of all, educate yourself, in particular in our state, with the limited vaccine exemption that is available. I read the 18-page interpretive rule to the code and became very, very familiar with it. Talked to some other people who had pursued the exemption, as I mentioned, as well at the statewide level. So educate yourself on it, and then just be strong. Be strong and stand up for yourself and your own bodily autonomy and God-given rights. And that's what she did and we did. And talk to some others if you need to have support in with that. But don't back down. It is your U.S. and in West Virginia, state constitutional rights to bodily autonomy as well. And it may come to that point if our legislature doesn't pass some health freedom legislation. Fortunately, this year there's a lot in the works, but nothing has passed yet.
But you got her back in school?
We did. We were able to keep her in school with a court order. We had to, again, obtain an injunction and restraining order against the school. And that was the only way she was allowed to go back in school. They weren't going to let her in school otherwise. And while we were continuing the exemption process, she was allowed to stay in school again under court order. And by the time the hearing came around, which was one of the last exhaustive procedures in the process, it was near graduation. So she graduated, and then the case ended up being dropped as a moot point, but not without the school's attorney claiming he was going to pursue an appeal even though she was out of school, which fortunately did not happen.
Could you share with us some of the things that you had to fight? So why would, say, your daughter get a medical exemption? What kind of things do you have to talk about to get that passed?
Well, one of the things we found out with the medical exemption is there were no doctors in the state of West Virginia that would actually write one. So we were able to find an out-of-state doctor that we had a meeting with, and recognizing some minor issues. Fortunately, I know there's been plenty of bad stories. Fortunately, hers was a minor issue to a prior vaccine. We kind of put the pieces together, identified that, and used that as our basis for the exemption. And what's ironic is that there is a state health immunization officer who is an unelected state bureaucrat that has never met you or your child, but in their letter of denial, they insist that it is within the child's best interest to get the shot after never have met her.
So this is a meningitis shot, right?
The senior year meningitis booster shot, correct.
Do you remember, as you were doing your research on this, some of the well-known side effects to this shot?
Well, I know the one in particular was fertility issues, potential long-term fertility issues, and that was one that really stuck with her and was her guiding principle to not want to get it. And I know there were, it's a rare occasion, but I know that there was actually a death from the meningitis shot.
Oh yeah, we've done injuries on the meningitis
I'm sure you
shot.
know much more than I do.
And what is your daughter doing today? She sounds like an amazing young woman.
She is. Actually, we were fortunate to participate in a statewide podcast yesterday, which is coming out today on the same subject, and she did an incredible job. She is a freshman in college in North Carolina and doing a wonderful job and continuing to fight for herself.
What does she want to be?
She is focusing on business with a major in marketing, which is
wonderful.
Down my path.
Well, we need her at Children's Health Defense, I think.
She's a great lady, and I want to thank Children's Health Defense. Actually, during our litigation, we reached out to you all, which you probably aren't aware, and were very helpful. Your company was very helpful in providing our attorney some information that he was able to use without knowing where to research as much, because it's something that you all obviously know in depth.
Wonderful to hear that. Any last words or anything else you would like to say to our people listening to you?
Just don't be afraid to stand up for yourself and stand up for what's right. This is what America needs right now. We need people that are willing to not only stand up for themselves but their country, and it all goes in together. And there's a lot of people out there that you may think you're alone or in fewer number, but I think that we're in greater number than what people may believe.
Amen to that. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.